Kicking the list off at number 10 is, I think, the best Blood Angels book, and that is The Devastation of Baal by Guy Haley. And this is the cover spin animation where I would show you the book if I could afford one. When I got back into the game of Warhammer 40k in like 2015 or something, Blood Angels was the army that got me really excited about painting, and I have painted hundreds of little red spacemen at this point. And this book, after I read this book, just doubled my interest in the army. Set during the Tyranid invasion of Baal, the home planet, the ancestral home planet of the Blood Angels, the home planet of their dead Primarch Sanguinius, Devastation of Baal tells the story of an almost hopeless defense against the Tyranids. The Tyranids are coming en masse. The majority of the Imperium's military force are elsewhere, namely at the Battle of Cadia, and are far too away to come help the Blood Angels. Dante, the Primarch of the Blood Angels, has sent the Gene Seed away, knowing that this is an almost hopeless defense. The Gene Seed will at least secure some future for the Blood Angels, and has called all the successors of the chapters that used to be a part of the Legion and have been broken up or have been built since, all of the children of Sanguinius back to Baal to help defend. And there's all these different chapters of Space Marines, of Blood Angel successor chapters arriving on Baal and fighting alongside the Blood Angels themselves that makes this such a fantastic book. We have proper high-standing, lovely Imperial Space Marines of the highest standing like the Blood Angels, but we also have Gabriel Seth and his Flesh Terrors. We have whole chapters who have been excommunicated by the Inquisition, who are steps away from being renegade chapters, but they still consider themselves the sons of Sanguinius, and they still come back to help defend Baal. And the interactions between the Blood Angels and their successor chapters and the different successor chapters with each other and the characters within them is really fascinating and brings quite a good amount of character work to what is otherwise, like a bolter point, right? The majority of this book is just combat and warfare and defense and heroic actions, but they're written so well and they're interspersed with these really good, for lack of a better term, human moments that it just works. Technically, this is a follow-up to Guy Haley's book Dante, which tells the story of the chapter master of the Blood Angels, Dante, and his, rise to where he is now, and his story from when he was an aspirant. And I would recommend reading that. That is also a fantastic book. Of the two, this is my favourite. And I don't think Dante is required reading to enjoy Devastation of Baal. I read Devastation of Baal before I read Dante, but I did know a lot about the Blood Angels going in. This is probably not a very good starting point if you don't know anything about the Blood Angels. It might be, but I didn't read it with that lens in mind, so I'm not 100% sure. I think this is one of the best examples of warfare from a Space Marine's perspective. One of the examples that shows it from all the different perspectives, shows all the different feels, the space combat, ground combat, all that sort of stuff in here. And I think it's one of, but not the best, of the sort of Space Marine battle sort of books. All right, before we jump to number 9, a few quick points just to get ahead of some comments, which I know you're going to leave anyway. I see you. Firstly, this was the hardest list I've made so far. I have another 5 to 10 books that could have easily made this list if I just rejiggered things a little bit, It wouldn't be too hard for me to convince myself to put different books on here. But that being said, this is only books I've read. You won't see any fantasy books on here. I haven't read any Warhammer fantasy books. You won't see any Age of Sigmar books. You won't see any Siege of Terror books because I'm only halfway through the Horus Heresy. I think I've read 35 or 38 of the books. So I'm obviously only drawing from books that I've read to put on the list of best books that I've read. If there's a book here that you think is just atrocious that it's not on here, let me know in the comments below. I'll let you know if I've read it. I'll let you know if I haven't read it. I'll add it to my TBR. And if I have read it and I didn't like it as much as these books, I might let you know why, and we can just have a bit of a fight about it. Also, this is absolutely only my opinion. If you have different opinions about these books, that's fantastic. That's what makes this hobby so interesting, is talking about our different opinions. No one's opinion is wrong. If you hate the books I've put up here, I don't think you're wrong or bad as a person. I just think we've got different tastes, and that's all there is to it. And finally, I'm 100% cheating, but it's okay because it's my list. Fight me. There are way more than 10 books on this list. I have combined trilogies and duologies and whatnot, just because I couldn't separate them, or I don't think they should be separated. And in all but one case, I think it makes perfect sense, because they're by the same author. They're very clearly just like the next series, and in most of them, they've been released together in like an omnibus or something. I think the only one people might argue with me about is number 9. The Horus Heresy is full of stories of brother facing brother, betrayal, allies turning on each other, all of that. That is the core of what's really going on in the whole series, really. But I think one of the best, if not the best story of betrayal, of traitors, and of forces on either side of the conflict acting kind of opposite to the way you would expect them to, considering who's on the good and bad sides, is the duology of ℚ𝕬𝕗 Suns by Graham McNeill and ℙ𝕚𝕚𝕚 by Dan Abnett. Combined, these books tell the story of the Space Wolves Legion being charged with bringing Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the ℚ𝕬𝕗 Suns, to Terra to answer for perceived crimes. In ℚ𝕬𝕗 Suns, we see things from the ℚ𝕬𝕗 Suns' perspective, we see things from Magnus's perspective, and we explore this legion that, until this point really, was kind of shrouded in a bit of mystery. This legion gets expanded upon here. We see their beliefs, we see how they act, we see how they treat one another, we see how Magnus feels about what he's doing, and we see that the side of the war that he ends up on is not the side he ever foresaw him joining. It's not how he thought things would go, and it's not what he meant when he did what he did. And during ℚ𝕬𝕗 Suns, you will see and feel how unfairly they were treated, and you will begin to hate the Space Wolves, and you'll side with the ℚ𝕬𝕗 Suns, and you will hate Leman Russ, and you will hate the Space Wolves. And then we see things from their side in ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚, and you will maybe continue to hate the Space Wolves, but that's fine. But you will see that they have this rich belief system and this rich culture of their own that is at odds with the culture of the ℚ𝕬𝕗 Suns, and together they really combine to show you both sides of the conflict. ℚ𝕬𝕗 Suns contains more of the actual burning of Prospero than ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚 does, and I recommend reading that one first. And ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚 is a little bit slower, but I think the insight into a Space Marine Legion you get out of this book, because most of it is from the perspective of a human remembrancer, is invaluable. There's very few other Space Marine books that I think give you such a deep dive into their culture, belief system, religious beliefs, how they act and think, and how they treat one another, including people within their own Legion and the Space Marines that are outside of their Legion, than ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚. I think these two books, for me, catapulted two Legions that I thought were quite silly and I wasn't interested in it at all, to some of my favourites now. I would love to put together a 30k army of either of these. In fact, I've often looked at doing that. And it's just the richly detailed culture behind both of these in these books that I really like so much. The characters aren't the strongest of any of the books on this list. The action isn't the best of any of the books on this list, but combined, they are probably the best cultural exploration of these two Space Marine Legions that has ever been put on page. And I know putting two books by different authors in one spot is cheating, absolutely. Again, it's my list, fight me. I struggle to separate the two. If you only want to read one, read ℚ𝕬𝕗 Suns. I think it slightly nudges ahead of the other one as the best one, but in my head, I read them back to back. They are a combined story as far as I'm concerned, seeing the same events from two sides, and I just think it's definitely worth checking out. Number 8 is a book that convinced me that the new Necron lore is better than the old Necron lore. I was always a bit iffy when the Necrons changed to this sort of dynastic, semi-Egyptian thing, but this book convinced me that that was way better, way more tragic, way more interesting. It is Robert Rath's first Black Library novel, a real tour de force, and a book that I have perhaps a very controversial opinion on, but it is The Infinite and the Divine. The story of two near immortal beings, both with different goals and aims, but directed towards the same object, for different needs and wants, but they want the same object, and they are oftentimes, during this book, at heads, outright competing with each other, forced to work together, trying to kill each other. The relationship between the two characters in this book is just fantastic. This is almost the funniest Warhammer book I've ever read. The humour is this dry wit that is really, really well done. It reminds me of classic British humour, and I think anyone that enjoys that sort of thing is going to love this book. The dialogue is some of the best ever written in a Black Library novel, and the actual plot itself is super interesting, full of twists and turns that, while perhaps not all the time the most unique, are very, very interesting and very well written. I have a full review of this up on the channel in the corner. Pow! I held off making this video for a month or so that I could finish reading this book, so that I could get this book to arrive and read it. After all the comments I got on my How to Start Warhammer video, which is in the corner, pow, telling me that I'd missed out The Infinite and the Divine for that list, I knew I had to read it before I made this list, and I'm really glad I did. Because 1, absolutely it makes my top 10. The book's fantastic. And 2, I got to tell everyone that I thought that this was an absolutely atrocious beginner Warhammer book. I think this is a fantastic book. It's in my top 10 Warhammer books, but it doesn't do a good job of explaining anything to a new reader. If you come into this book having looked at, the YouTubers, having read the wikis, having, flipped through the rule books or any of that sort of stuff, you'll be great. You'll be fine. You'll love it. But if I handed this to my wife who knows nothing about Warhammer, she'd be lost immediately. It doesn't explain enough to be a really good beginner Warhammer book, but it is a fantastic book for anyone that's already familiar with the lore. Speaking of books that are really bad beginner Warhammer books, one of my favorites of all time, this book by ℓ𝕚𝕚, focusing on the titanic, colossal god war machines of the 40k universe, the Titans, the Cult Mechanicus, and the human beings that surround both of these things. It is Titanicus by ℓ𝕚𝕚. The Cult Mechanicus can often be portrayed in a sort of hit or miss way as far as I'm concerned in 40k fiction. Sometimes they're portrayed as basically cold, heartless, soulless automatons, but this book I think portrays the Mechanicus in the way that I like them portrayed, which is, yes, dogmatic, religious, fanatic, but under all that, distinctly human, with all of the characters in this book having wants and needs and goals and ambitions and fears and flaws that are all underneath that layer of Cult Mechanicus dogma, underneath all the cybernetics, underneath all the tech. They are still living, breathing, thinking human beings that have human emotions and human relationships. And I don't think I've seen a book capture that quite as well as Titanicus. Obviously, the focus of Titanicus is on the Titans. The story is the Legio Invicta Titans have come back to their Forge world in desperate need of repair, rearmament, and rest and recuperation for their crews. But having just arrived, this repair and this rearmament not complete yet, the Forge world comes under attack by a massive Chaos warband. And at the head of this warband is a Chaos Titan force that is even larger than Legio Invicta. And Legio Invicta is forced to march out in defense of their Forge world against this greater force. And this is the story of how they try and defend their planet. And it's the relationships between all the crew that really get to me here. The crew, as I've said, are human, but you also see the aspects of the Titans that they pilot being taken on board within them, whether it's the Warhound Titan pilots pacing during the meetings because they don't like the standing still, and the other sort of emotions like that that bleed through to these Titan pilots, and then the interpersonal relationships and the rivalries within these crews that just make the moments that aren't action just as exciting. And those action moments are some of my favorites. I still think engine kill whenever I see like a big robot get destroyed in any sort of fiction, video game, movie, anything. And that's straight from here is where I first heard that. The action in here is written that gives these machines the scale and strength and the sort of slow, plodding nature that is missing in some of the other books about them, and just gives them the presence on the page that makes them so important. And just, that's how I like my Titans written. I love it when they're firing, one blast every now and then, but with such strong power that it just oomphs off the page. And on top of that, we have all these subplots, and in normal ℓ𝕚𝕚 fashion, we maybe have a few too many characters, but the majority of them are fantastic. We have betrayals, emotional connections, we have rivalries, ambitions, we have secrets and religious and political intrigue within the Cult Mechanicus, and we get to see the defense of this Forge world from several different points of view, mostly focused on the Titans. And it's going to be a favourite of mine forever, I think. Just a quick thank you to everyone that's still watching. This is where I would tell you about the links in the description below where you could pick up these books for yourself. If you could pick up these books for yourself, but Black Library is insistent on never reprinting or keeping any of their books in stock. So the majority of these books are hideously expensive on the secondhand market because scalpers know Warhammer players pay a large price for things. Please don't buy these books secondhand if you're looking at them and they're hundreds of dollars. That's ridiculous. I believe all of these books are available on Audible or in other audiobook formats, and all the Black Library books I've listened to on Audible have had fantastic narrators. I think all of these books are available in ebook. For whatever books are available in paperback, I will have a link in the description below, but otherwise I will have a link to their ebook or their audiobook versions. Please just don't go on eBay and pay the ridiculous prices people are asking for these books. Don't support that sort of behavior. And if you want more Warhammer content from my channel, then let me know. Currently my plan is to try and read a Black Library book every month, and I record a video and review it every month. And if there's any particular topics in there you want me to focus on, then let me know. Do you want me to read some more Space Marine stuff? Do you want me to talk a bit more about Gaunt's Ghosts? I've read about 5 of them, but I haven't really talked about them very much. Do you want me to read some fantasy stuff? Do you want me to look more at the Xeno stuff? Or do you want to kick me in the ass and make me actually finish the Horus Heresy and get started on the Siege of Terror? As I said, I think I've got about 20 books left in the Heresy before I start on the Siege of Terror stuff. Either way, just let me know, and if you want to make sure that you don't miss out on those videos, then hit the subscribe button below, and just thank you so much for watching up till this point. Up next is the first, but not last, book by who I think is the strongest author that currently writes for Black Library, and that is ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚, and this is the Black Legion series, starting with Town of Horus. Telling the story of the defeated Chaos Space Marines from the traitor legions in the wake of the Horus Heresy. The Black Legion series talks about these disparate groups of infighting Space Marines when a few groups of them decide it's finally time to find a leader that can put them back on the right path, put them back towards a single goal of defeating their enemies that put them in this position, of fighting back against the Imperium. Seeking out a leader who has the skill, the drive, the hatred necessary to bring these disparate groups of Chaos Space Marine legions together into a single unified fighting force. I think there's a common misconception that the Black Legion is just the Sons of Horus, and this book does a lot to dissuade you of that, and this book really describes the death of the Sons of Horus and the birth of the Black Legion, under the leadership of ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚. ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚𝕚 just understands Chaos Space Marines. He just understands how to write bad guys in a way that I don't think anyone else I've ever read has got. These books take Abaddon and the Black Legion and Chaos Space Marines as a whole from this sort of almost comical villainy that they were in my mind before these books, this almost Saturday morning breakfast cereal, evil for evil's sake villains, into characters whose motivations make sense to me, into characters who I find myself rooting for, into characters I find myself caring for and feeling empathy towards. And it does a fantastic job of showing how the characters we knew in the Horus Heresy are still around in 40k, how the Ezekiel Abaddon from the first few books of the Horus Heresy still exist 10,000 plus years later, and what's happened and what's changed there to get them to this point. Told from the point of view of a Thousand Sons sorcerer under his employ, it is just an absolute masterpiece of how to write a villain. And it's not only is this not going to be the last time we see ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚𝕚 on this list, it's not even going to be the last time we see him writing the bad guys on this list. In fact, number 5 is Hell's Reach by ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚𝕚. When the hive world of Armageddon is attacked by the Orcs, Grimaldus of the Black Templar Space Marine chapter is tasked with taking a force of Black Templars down to the surface of the planet to defend the hive city of Hell's Reach. Hell's Reach is facing a nearly impossible task. The Orcs are coming in a size almost never seen before, and the green tide of flesh and weaponry is just going to barrel over the city. The city with millions of occupants, and their only hope is this relatively smaller force, I think about 100, of Black Templar Space Marines. It's all that stands between them and certain death. The mood of this book is slightly different to most Space Marine books, I think. Most Space Marine books have the grimdark feeling, but are kind of action books. And this book does have some great action scenes, but the overwhelming mood, I think, of this book, at least the way I read it, was a sort of melancholic depression. This dreary knowledge that this defense is worthless. They're never going to succeed. It's hopeless. It's a campaign the Black Templars can't win. They can just postpone defeat. And I think does a really good job of highlighting that common soldier saying that it's the time between battles, the waiting, that is the worst part. Large parts of this book take place in the lulls in between moments of combat, and you see the desperation and the weariness of all the supporting characters and of our Space Marines. This is from the Space Marine Battles book, which is commonly kind of seen as just straight action, just, you know, bolter. And there is some of that here. The action scenes in here are fantastic, but ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚 brings a much more complete and complex narrative here than I think we see in most of those books. And it's thanks to his character writing again in characters like 𝕓𝕚𝕚 and the supporting cast and the action and the mood that, just like before, he made me buy more Warhammer models. Black Legion and Talon of Horus made me buy a Black Legion army, and Hell's Reach, I now have a Black Templar army. Thanks, ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚. All right, we're over halfway. Let's keep going. Number 4 is, for my money, the best entry point into Warhammer 40k. It's not a unique view. I know a lot of people share this view. But if you're looking to get anyone into Warhammer, first off, I do have that video, pow. But also, this is the book I would give them. And that book is Eisenhorn by Dan Abnett. Warhammer can often be seen as being told from this point of view of almost godlike beings. When you've got the Primarchs as the lead characters, or even Space Marines, you're so far above the general human population that it's hard to see the scope and the emotion and the day-to-day struggles that members of the Imperium really have. And while Gregor Eisenhorn, the titular character of this book, is still, you know, well above a normal human being, he is human. He does have human emotions and thoughts and wants and needs, and he does deal with humans in a way that is very human. As an Inquisitor of the Imperium, he is essentially, what is he? He's essentially a soldier, cross-spy, cross-detective with super judicial powers. And these books follow the career of Gregor Eisenhorn, and most importantly, I think, his team. The surrounding supporting cast that are there with him, each with their own unique roles and responsibilities, their own skills, that combine to make this formidable fighting force that is the Inquisitor's team, but also their own wants and needs and interpersonal relationships, and their own thoughts of their boss, Gregor Eisenhorn, their own reasons for being here and for working with him. These books read as a super cool spy thriller, and one of the best I've ever read. We start off with Gregor Eisenhorn chasing down the head of a chaos cult, and from there, the plot just spirals into intrigue and mystery and action, and involves high levels of the Imperium. It involves all the different enemy forces that basically exist in Warhammer. And most of all, we see Eisenhorn's own struggles as he tries to protect the Imperium he loves from the dark powers that he abhors, but the steps he has to take to accomplish that perhaps go against who he thought he was as a person. And it's that growth and exposure to this character that make these books so fantastic. On top of the intrigue and the plots and the twists and the turns, the Eisenhorn books are just a perfect blend of the action and the relationships and the emotional beats that you need to make a good book, and they are just some of the best Warhammer books that exist. For number 3, we're going back to the 30k timeline, we're going back to the Horus Heresy, and we're returning with another Dan Abnett book, and that is Know No Fear by Dan Abnett. Having not yet learned of the betrayal of Horus the Warmaster, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, ℓ𝕚𝕚𝕚, musters his legion around the world of Calth in preparation for a campaign against the Orcs. When out of nowhere, a word-bearer's fleet translates into the system, and he reaches out assuming that they're here to aid in his campaign against the Orcs, when they unleash a crippling, devastating, all-out attack against the Ultramarines. Know No Fear does the best job of any book I've read of showing the totality of a conflict, showing the war from so many different angles and perspectives, and showing them rooted in their timeline, that it becomes very easy to follow the whole conflict and to see all the different moving pieces. And it has my absolute favorite framing device that any of these sort of Warhammer books have, and that's the Mark of Calth. This ongoing ticking clock counting the time that has elapsed for the conflict. And it's at the start of every chapter, ticking forward. You can see that this took place 15 minutes after the previous chapter. This took place a day after the chapter before. And you can really see and build the entire timeline of the conflict in your head as you read. And it's just, I love the Mark of 𝕬𝕠𝕠𝕜. I might be a minority placing this book so high in my list and so high up in the Horus Heresy, but I think this is kind of what most Horus Heresy books should be. This is fantastic action scenes, fantastic warfare, with brutal betrayal, with tragedies, with brutal emotions, and with a real story of shock and disbelief and that moment of realization of being betrayed by someone that you couldn't have even contemplated this from. And it's just fantastic. The pace of this novel is just completely breakneck. From start to finish, we are just moving. We're never in the same place for more than a few pages, and it helps to really show the spread and the scale of the conflict and just how many individuals are involved. We have space, naval combat, ground forces, sieges, spec ops missions. We have moments with the commanders and command bases all the way to the ground forces right on the front lines. We have moments with humans, we have moments with space marines. At its heart, this is a space marine battle book. This is about fighting between space marines, but the emotional beats in here and the emotional range from like Excel spreadsheet 𝕬𝕠𝕠𝕜 is fantastic as well. But for my money, the best the Horus Heresy has to offer is, and no prizes for guessing the author, number 2, ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚𝕚𝕚 duology, The First Heretic and Betrayer. The First Heretic shows us the true beginnings of the Horus Heresy. That things didn't start with Horus's fall to chaos and the cursed dagger. That things begun, really, with the corruption of the Wordbearers Legion and the corruption of ℓ𝕠𝕠𝕠, their Primarch. This is perhaps the most tragic of all the Horus Heresy books, in my opinion. Seeing ℓ𝕠𝕠𝕠's fall, being there right beside him as you see what leads to these decisions and leads to what happens. It's one of those moments where you know the outcome. You know, you've seen this movie before, but you hope maybe this time it turns out differently. This was what reading this book is for me. I know what happens with ℓ𝕠𝕠𝕠, but as he starts going down that path, I'm just hoping that it goes differently. I'm hoping that the Emperor reaches out to him. I'm hoping that he reaches out to one of his brothers. I'm hoping that something goes right for him, even though I know the outcome. ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚𝕚 once again, as I think is just his signature at this point, makes me care for the quote-unquote bad guys. He writes characters so well that I root for them despite different morals from myself. I don't care that he's going to do awful things. I don't care that he's involved in demonology and whatnot. I just want ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚 to be okay. I want ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚 to get what he wants. Whereas First Heretic focuses on that original corruption of the Wordbearers for the most part, then after that in Betrayer we follow this fully corrupted Wordbearers Legion as they work their magic on the World Eaters. As we see ℓ𝕠𝕠𝕠 take the raging, angry, broken Primarch of the World Eaters, ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚, and in his own way try to help him. And again, it is a tale of tragedy. Here we see why ℓ𝕠𝕠𝕠 wasn't at Calth in Know No Fear, because he was here striking deep into the heart of Ultramar alongside the World Eaters. We have two of my favourite characters of all time in this book, with ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚 and Khan, as well as perhaps the most hated individual in the entirety of the Warhammer fandom, Erebus of the Wordbearers. I don't know if an author has ever written a villain that I hate so much. I don't know if they've ever written a character in such a way that makes me that emotional and makes me feel that level of hatred. And again, these two books take two legions, which I thought of as kind of one-dimensional, and makes them vibrant, conflicted, flawed, interesting groups of characters who I really care for. All the while, they're just slaughtering civilians or something, and I forget that they were the bad guys for a second. But speaking of slaughtering civilians, number 1 is the Night Lords trilogy by ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚𝕚. This will come as no surprise to anyone I've talked to about Warhammer books. It'll come as no surprise to anyone that's seen any of my previous videos where I've talked about Warhammer, or even my top 10 sci-fi videos, because this is not only one of my favourite Warhammer books, my favourite Warhammer book, this is one of my favourite sci-fi books of all time. This is one of my favourite books of all time. I think all of the books on this list transcend that sort of, you know, IP novel stigma that gets thrown around, but this is the book that I think, you know, maybe it's a hard read a bit if you don't know anything about Warhammer, but I think you'd pull it off. I think you could give this to just a sci-fi reader and they'd enjoy themselves. I think they'd see how good this book was, just like I did. This book follows essentially the terrorists of the Warhammer 40k universe, the Night Lords, a legion known for using fear tactics and terrorism and using fear as a weapon, and follows them in their millennia-long struggle to find victory, purpose, survival. I don't even know if the Night Lords know what they want at this point. This book has some of the best action scenes out of any Warhammer 40k book I've read. In this book, we see Talos and 10th Claw taking on a myriad of foes, from Xenos to Imperium to other Chaos Warbands, in some of my favourite space combat and in some of my favourite shipboarding scenes and in planetary conflicts. And the pacing of the book means that at no point was I getting bored. But again, as with all of his other books, it's ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚𝕚's character work that draws me back to this book time and time again. He just does such a fantastic job of fleshing out these characters who are, no arguments here, the bad guys, and gives them these wants and needs and ambitions and goals and makes me feel empathy towards them, makes them understandable, and humanizes these greater-than-life figures. And it's just fascinating how he writes these characters with these motivations and thoughts and feelings in such a way that makes me feel like, yeah, no, I can see why you're here. I can see what situation led you to here. And of course I can see why the only way forward is through the orphanage fire that you set. And all the members of 10th Claw, led by Talos, are just fantastic, very different, unique characters. And it's their almost antagonistic nature towards each other. There's almost hatred they seem to feel towards each other at times, cemented by this brotherhood of the, you know, family, they will die for each other sort of feeling, that just makes the book full of complex and interesting characters. And we get to see a lot of this from the point of view of human serfs that are aboard the Night Lord spaceship as well. These humans that have been brought on board as slaves and now serve the Night Lords, and we get to see their interactions with each other and with their master space marines, which show things from a more human and a more scary perspective. And on top of that, one of the things I love most is the logistics that are in this book. You know, normally Space Marines have as much bolter ammo as they need. Maybe they'll run out because that's what the story needs at that point. But generally, you don't talk about ammo or food or supplies or anything like that in these books. But here, the Night Lords are at the edge of their rope. They don't have a homeworld. They've lost the Horus Heresy. They don't have a Primarch. They don't have a leader. They don't have a combined force. The members of 10th Claw's armor, what bits are remaining of their original suits, have been repaired so many times. They're always on the brink of failure. They're using weapons and armor scavenged from their enemies. They're using ammunition wherever they can get it. And it's this desperate nature that fuels the conflicts and the plotline of the book. ℚ𝕚𝕚𝕚𝕚 captured pure space magic with this trilogy. And I'm really not sure if I'm ever going to read a Warhammer book that can top this one in my mind. There you go. That is my top 10 Warhammer books. If you're still watching this ridiculously long video, thank you so much. If you are, question of the day is, how wrong am I? What's your top 10 Warhammer books? Which books that I didn't mention here am I just a fool for not including? What heresy have I committed today, in your opinion? But most of all, just please remember to keep reading.